But I think it's, and I wanted to touch on this with you because I have many conversations with different people, especially people from that era, people who made decisions to move outside of music at a younger age, and and this idea of like your mum would always say, "Oh, make sure you have something to fall back on," and when you're a young fella, that always seems so kind of like weak or cowardly, like, "Oh, I don't need anything to fall back on. I'm going to be a rock star. This is." If I have anything to fall back on, then I'm not going to commit myself fully to this thing. And yet now that I'm at the age that my parents would have been, that they were saying those things, I can see that making that decision to wholeheartedly pursue music with no other eye to anything else, it's put a lot of eggs in the basket that, has proven to not work out for way more people than it ever did work out for,
Yeah. No, it's funny you say that. And I think you've sort of hit the nail on the head. For me, I think early on I realised that, as much as I wanted music to work, I also realised that you're right. The successful people are far and few between, and everyone else sort of carves out this sort of okay lifestyle, but it comes off the back of a hell of a lot of hard work and a lot of hours of effort. I mean, my uncle's a jazz musician, for example, and he's always playing gigs, but you've got to diversify. You've got to do gigs. You've got to be a teacher. You've got to, do all of those things to make it work. And I think from post the BE days for me, that was the first thing I did was I realised that, shit, I'm going to need to have something to fall back on here because, I was in the same boat. I was kind of, pushing hard to make this a career. And when you're 18, 19, 20, that's all you care about, And, the best thing I ever did was went back to uni, and I'm actually a lawyer now by trade. And I'm glad I did it because, I'm now in a position where I've got a good career outside of music now, and I can do that, and I can dip in to the projects I want to dip into when I want. It gives you a bit more flexibility in your lifestyle, which I'm all for, and I think it's all about balance. For me personally, it's all about balance, and especially now in this sort of bizarre post-COVID world. I think a lot of people are striving for that.
Totally, and I mean we still have discussions all the time. Thinking about. Benny at, 40, just turned 41, I guess, having that discussion of what's next, because, I'm content. I've just finished, 5-6 cover gigs in a row, and I enjoy that. I'm not like one of those people that really begrudges, walking into the pub and going, oh, Jesus, I've got to go and do this shit again. Fuck, I quite enjoy it, especially if you've got a decent crowd or whatever, and but it does beg the question of when is it going to ever be when is it going to be like too much? When are you going to not want to turn around and strap on a guitar and sing Brown Eyed Girl? Is it going to be 65? Maybe. Is it, are you going to be trying to huck for gigs when you're 70 because you don't have any super, and Benny's sort of going, what do I want to do? I want to go back to uni at 41. And, one of the guys, Forrester, I don't know whether you ever met him, but he's a producer that did a lot of stuff with us through the middle period of the band. And he's just gone back to being a doctor. He's, he's same age as the boys, and he's 41, and he's back at medical school, just did the GAMSTED or whatever it is to get into. And because it's like, well,
you got to pay the bills, man.
Yeah, totally. And as much as you don't, you think it's a bit dumb to retrain at 41, it's still better to do that than to do it at 51 or whatever. So I was doing nursing for a while, and I didn't finish it because it's a toxic environment, and I didn't enjoy it. And it was really hard for me to take being someone who'd been a professional musician and been my own boss for 25 years to walk into a situation where I was like ground floor, especially in a career that has a tendency to belittle the people that are starting out. And I was like, probably an ego thing, but I also just didn't enjoy the work. But I'm now still kind of like, it's still bubbling away going, okay, what's
what's next. Yeah.
What's the retirement plan? You know, you've got 20 years or 25 years to kind of figure it out, but you got to make sure you really do. And that's why in situations where you're in at the moment, you go, well, it's a good spot to be in. And it's wiser in many ways, you know?
Yeah, I think you hit the nail on the head, Glenn, before, where you said, you know, you were talking about, you know, it's really hard to step into a career when you're used to being your own boss. And I completely get that. I mean, I even had that, you know, my early to mid 20s when I was starting out in my other career. But I think the advantage of doing it when you're young is you're young, and people are a lot more willing to give you a go at that age, and you're a lot more open, I think, because, you know, let's be honest, like when I was in the BE, far out, mate, we were kids, you know, like you think about it now, like we were just, I mean, I just can't believe it, really. Like we were, you know, 19, 20.
Well, I think you were like 21. I think the boys were like 21 when I joined, or 22 or something, yeah.
Yeah. So, you know, we were just naive, didn't know, you know, this is my personal view. It's just, we were young, we had no life experience, and just sort of flying by the seat of our pants a bit. And you don't think about the future when you're a young bloke at that age, you know, you just don't. And I'm actually, it's funny, at the time I was quite resentful about the fact that I had to have a career outside of music, you know. Back then I thought, oh, this is crap, you know, that's all I want to do, just want to play. And now it's not until you hit the 40s that you start to think, geez, I'm glad I did that then, because now I'm established in my other career, and it was hard at the time, but you've got, you know, I've now got sort of 15 years up my, you know, almost 20 years up my belt in another career, and so you're a long way, you know, into it, and you've then got that flexibility to do other stuff outside of that.
We made a documentary a couple of years ago, and Dave and everyone was having a bit of a chat about, you know, the early days, and I realised that I was super curious about your place and all of that, and that was never really talked about in the DVD, unfortunately. But I wanted to sort of suss out what the early days felt like for you and what you remember from that time, and, you know, I guess first things first, where did you start playing music? Was music around the house and stuff? Do you play anything else besides bass? What was your kind of early education and stuff in tunes?
Yeah, it's funny. Look, in terms of the early days for me, music-wise, I taught myself how to play the guitar. I, to this day, have never had a music lesson. I still don't know how to read music. Well, actually, I can, but I'd have to spend about 10 minutes translating it before I actually play it. So look, I started off, my uncle's a jazz musician. So I did have that sort of influence to the side, and I was very close with my aunt, my dad's sister, who's married to him, and he had this banged up old classical guitar at his house. I must have been, I don't know, 10 or something like that, and I was starting to, probably a little bit older, probably 11 or 12, and I just started to get into, you know, it was the early 90s, you know, Nirvana, Pearl Jam, and all that stuff was happening, and I just really wanted to learn to play the guitar. And he had this banged up old classical, and he said, look, why don't you can just take that home with you. And he gave me this chord book from about 1958. And I just remember sitting at home with this chord book and just trying to make my fingers work, you know. And so that's how it all started for me. I taught myself how to play the guitar through that chord book, you know, learning scales and chords and all that. And you know, ultimately I wanted to be a guitarist. But what's really funny is, you know, I think back to the school days, particularly in the 90s, as it were, you know, everyone wanted to play guitar and everyone wanted to play drums, but no one wanted to play the bass. And so for me, I thought, oh, you know, maybe if I got myself a bass, there'd be a few more options there for different bands, because I didn't know anyone else who had a bass guitar back then, you know. And I just happened to, very weirdly, at the time when I was living at home, I was a teenager, and where I was living, this French guy across the road had this bass, and we used to cut through his yard to get to the park. And I don't know what happened. I can't remember how it came up in conversation, but I managed to see this bass one day, and I said, "Oh, I didn't know you had this bass." And he said, "Oh, yeah, it just sits here. I never play it." And I don't know how I asked. I can't quite recall how I got my hands on it, but he basically said, "Look, why don't you just borrow it?" And I ended up holding on to this bass guitar for about the next 7 years or 6 years or something. And that's how I started off playing in bands in school.
That wasn't the red Yamaha that you had.
No. That was a terrible choice. The old red Yamaha was more about the funds available at the time than anything else.
I had one. It was one of the RBX guys. I had pretty much the exact same one when I first started out.
Yeah, it was all about the funds back then, or lack of. Yeah, so this bass, I can't remember what it was. I think it might have even been a Warwick, and it was pretty old. And anyway, it was a great bass, and I sort of just started playing bass in bands, and that's sort of how it all started for me. And then in the early BE days, that all started. I mean, I went to school with Ben and Kurt, and they were a year above me, so I was a bit younger than them. And, we sort of knocked around in similar circles. One of my good mates, I was playing in a band with him, and his brother was mates with Ben and Kurt. So we all kind of would see each other at people's houses and that sort of thing. And I remember Ben sort of saying, "Oh, would you mind playing this gig with us?" And I think I ended up sort of just jumping up for one song. In fact, it might have even been, it was a gig at school, and I think I got up and played Mad Men by Silverchair on the bass. And I remember at the time thinking, shit, that rocked, these guys are pretty good. And it wasn't until I think school kind of finished really that kind of BE stuff started to take off. We had a different singer at the time, as you know. Yeah, it's sort of funny. Like you think back on it now, it's 20 odd years ago. I mean, far out, time flies.
Was it Kurt jamming on that Silverchair song?
Yeah, Kurt was on guitar, Ben was on drums, I was on bass. I think Leo was on another guitar. Might have been someone else, I can't recall.
Did they have it was at Kelvin Grove, wasn't it?
Kelvin Grove High, yeah.
Did they have a good music program there with other people that like years later or prior that had gone through?
Yeah, well, I think I went to school with Kate Miller-Heidke.
Oh, she was in that program because Mr. Miller was your principal or something, wasn't he?
He was our principal, yeah. So I went to school with Kate. I think she ended up transferring out of Kelvin Grove High because I think everyone kept bagging her out because her dad was the principal. So yeah. So look, the great thing about KG was, it was very high on the arts. They had a lot of schools of excellence back then. So I know they had a dance school of excellence, had a rugby school of excellence, and their music program was pretty good. Not that I was, weirdly enough, ever involved in it, but I know there's been a few good bands that have come out of KG since.
Cool. And when did you guys start writing together, and how was that process? How did that work?
Must have been around 98, 99, sometime around there. I honestly can't recall how it all started, to be honest. I mean, Ben and Kurt might have better memories than I do of that time, but we just sort of started jamming, and a lot of it, I mean, Ben and Kurt always jammed, and they had their own sort of band. And then I think Ben reached out and sort of asked me to come into the fold because I think I was probably the only person he knew who played bass, to be honest.
I tell you, man, that is like how I've got most of my jobs, I reckon, in the world. People are looking for a bass player, and you're just like,
always, yeah.
No one wanted the gigs. They're always like, yeah, here we go, I can do this.
Yeah, I'll do it. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and we had this rehearsal room in Adelaide Street in Brizzy upstairs. I don't know if you ever saw that one.
I don't think I ever saw that one, but I did jam there with another band, I think, there once upon a time.
That was the early days. That was before we got the rehearsal room in the Valley. But in terms of the writing process, usually Kurt would come in, or anyone would come in with a riff. And to be honest with you, it was just a jam sesh. I don't know if that's sort of how you guys right now, but I think sort of back then, 20 odd years ago, someone would just bring a riff in and you'd end up sort of spending the next half an hour just jamming and just kind of seeing where it went. And we'd record the session, and if it was good, we'd keep the bits that were good, and if it was crap, we'd cut the bits that were crap, you know?
Yeah, that dovetails pretty well with what I sort of remember of the early days as well. Like Kurt usually bringing in the idea, and then sometimes like he and Ben would have worked on it a little bit beforehand or whatever. But generally speaking, then you're kind of like working backwards from a perspective of seeing what he's sort of given you, and you're going like trying to work your way around it, I guess. And it was, for me, there was always that push and pull from just wanting to like copy the lowest note that he would play on a riff, for example, and then also trying to think about some kind of counter melody or some other thing to go against that, sort of pull it out into some sort of different direction. I mean, I started doing some playthroughs of all the tracks, and I started from the start and went through and did all the EP tracks, and I was quite surprised that I'd actually not. There was at least 2 or 3 tracks that I'd not worked out the parts really correctly, and I was something like Perfection is actually quite a intricate part.
Oh, I appreciate that, Glenn, to be honest, because I sort of think back on that time, and you know, I'm a sort of self-deprecating kind of a guy, and I don't know that my bass playing was much more than pretty rudimentary back then, to be honest. Look, I think, I mean, I was a pretty young guy and pretty early on in my bass playing days, I guess then, and I was trying to. The thing I was going for was trying to leave a lot of space, because particularly with a lot of some of that more atmospheric stuff that we had back then, sometimes the bass can, if you're trying to do a run through some of that stuff, it just kind of wrecks it. And I wanted there to be enough space that it gave that atmosphere enough, I don't know, time and resonance, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. Yeah, totally. What did you feel like when Clint walked in for the first time? Had you heard him sing? Had you heard him sing prior to that? Because it was always the story that Ben came back from an Ipswich gig with him in his car, and he sang over the demo that you guys had, which had Sweet and Low, or whatever Sweet and Low was called before it was Sweet and Low, and that's when Benny went, "Oh, this guy, we got to steal this guy. He's the dude." Had you heard him sing like in that sort of format before, or did he just walk into the jam room?
No, we did go to a gig, but I can't recall if it was before or after that moment. You may be right. I don't know that I'd heard him, but I'm sure I heard him beforehand. So he was playing in a band called Seven Zark 7, wasn't he? Oh, you were in that band, weren't you?
7, yeah.
That's right, yeah.
I see you'd seen that. Yeah, cool.
Yeah, I remember we went to a Seven Zark gig once in the early days, but I don't know if that was.
Were you with Ben and Kurt that night at the was downstairs at that place on the corner of St. Paul's Terrace and like?
Yep, that's the one.
Top of the valley there, yeah. And that was like the last gig we did. I remember meeting Ben and Kurt that night, and I was a little bit smug at the time because I sort of was like, I'd meeting Benny and going, well, so sorry that we're about to take your singer to Melbourne. Little did I know. And then I think maybe even that same night we were loading out we were at Headspace rehearsals, and we were loading the gear out after that gig, and Clint went, I don't think I'm going to go to Melbourne. I think I'm going to stay here. And that's when we went, oh, cool. Well, we're going, and we're going to go, and then obviously the rest is history.
Yeah, look, I don't know. Sorry, mate. I was just going to say, I think we must have sort of already had a couple of jam sessions with him by that stage then. So Ben's probably, so I think the story with Ben's probably right.
Because I'd seen you guys play at the Basement, so there was that run of shows that Thursday night. You won the Jim Beam Award or whatever, and so you got every Thursday night for a month or something. You were played there, and I remember I came and saw that show. It was the old Kurt used to play with no shoes on and and this sort of stuff. And
the residency at the Basement, I remember that.
Man, that was amazing though, because I think that I think I maybe went twice, and I went the first week, and there was like 50 people there, and there was like 300 people there by the time the month had rounded out. And I sort of remember thinking to myself, "Oh, he's not fucking coming to Melbourne. He's not going to give this up. There's a vibe." And there was all the gigs we did with Seven's Arc. I love the hang, and I love the music to this day, but there was just a new level of energy with the Butts, and I know that you know, being inside it, you would have felt that as well. Like there was just sort of
100%.
It just sort of everyone was going, "Oh, these guys are doing something different." You know, there's an energy to this that, you know, we haven't seen before. You know, or was uncommon at least.
Well, I vividly recall Clint coming to one of the first jams where we're in Adelaide Street, and it was actually The Cell, which was the song that sort of Triple J picked up. And I remember we were jamming through it, and to this day, I must admit, I think Clint is probably the most talented vocalist that I've ever worked with. His range and his ability, like I remember he just had an acoustic guitar one day, and he was just, you know, strumming like one chord, and the melody that he sang over the top of it, I was just mesmerised. I was thinking, how can this guy be so talented? You know. I mean, I just don't have that, you know, inherent ability that he was lucky enough to be born with, I think.
You could tell him to sing three different choruses, and he'd just go, "Okay, sing something different, sing something different," you know, and that'd all be amazing, you know.
You know, and it just comes out of nowhere. It's just crazy. And I remember being in this jam, and we were smashing through The Cell, and it hit that end part. And I don't know if we were recording it at the time. We may have. And I just remember Clint just let loose with what it was. You know, we ended up going to the recording studio and doing. And it was just one of those goosebump moments. You know, when all four of you are sort of, you're all looking at each other going, "Shit, this is pretty good." And you know you're onto something. You know what I mean? There's that energy there that you can't. I don't think if you don't play in a band, it's very difficult to describe. It's like pulling lightning down from the sky. There's this energy there that, you know, and everyone felt it. And I think we were all just like, "Holy shit, this is amazing."
So was that? I was always under the impression. Well, I mean, I'd always assumed that it was something of a studio creation, because there is multiple layers in the final recording. But do you think that maybe the first time he ever did that ending was actually improvised in the jam room?
100%.
Wow.
Yeah, he just improvised the whole thing, and it's pretty much what he ended up recording, to be honest with you. And I remember just sitting there. It was like the song finished, and there was almost like this strange moment of like a minute of just complete silence, as we all just absorbed what had just happened, you know? And I think, yeah, when you know you're onto something, that's the moment where you realise, shit, this is pretty good.
That's totally, yeah. That's incredible. I mean, I had no idea that it was made up. For some reason, I sort of thought of Dave kind of in the background, kind of going, "Oh, now do this, and now maybe go up on this part." But no, that's really, really cool. That would have been an amazing moment.
Yeah, that's my recollections anyway. Could be tainted by 20 years of doing other things, but that's what I recall.
There's some footage of the Espy show that you guys did. I guess it was on maybe the COG support, or maybe it was the tour that you did after COG, but I think it might have been the COG support if I recall. But someone's got maybe 3 songs from that Espy show up on YouTube, and The Cell's one of them. And at that point, Clint is almost collapsed in a puddle by the end of singing that. And of course, we went on to start playing to a click track, but Benny wasn't playing with a click track at that time, as you would know. And so the energy, the tempo that final like chorus here, it's it's like, whoa. But it's just, and he just goes, just a big puddle at the end. It's you sort of get a sense then of what that was like, in the early days. And I think anything with you'd be certainly aware of is that those moments become less and less like lightning in a bottle and more just trying to recapture some facsimile of what it went on to become, you know. So
yeah, and look, I think that's one of the challenges of the creative process, isn't it? That, you know, we've all been in bands before where, I mean, I don't know about you, but I've always found that the songs that work, it doesn't matter what band you're in and what genre you play. You know, I found that the ones that are the good songs are the ones that just seemingly come out of nowhere, and you write them in a really quick amount of time, and suddenly they're just there, and you go, shit, that's the song. Whereas the songs that it's like trying to, you know, leach blood out of a stone. You're sitting there and you're going over and over, spending hours and hours on it. You come back the next day and you try and work on it again. You're better off just shelving it, just starting again, because it just, you know, I remember being in the jam room of many different bands over the years, and when you hit that part of the creative process, that's where it gets frustrating, because, you know, people get tired, people get frustrated, and it just doesn't make for a conducive creative process, in my view.
You need to maintain that energy. And I mean, I always think any things that we've been inspired by subsequent to that have always been the stuff that's come pretty quickly. And I mean, it is actually a bit indicative of where we're at creatively at the moment, because of everything that's slowed down the process so much. Sometimes we're sitting on some demos that we've been throwing backwards and forwards for 10 or 12 years. And for me, I almost am in that same position as you, where I go, should we maybe put those to the side? Maybe there should be B-sides, maybe there should be other things, because I think that maybe we've bashed the life out of them. And we're just doing that thing. We're chasing a facsimile of a facsimile of a facsimile of an idea that once was inspiring, you know, and it becomes, you just can't find it anymore. And even when we kind of chop them apart and re-put them back together in another way, it's kind of like, it's hard to get as excited, you know, subsequently. So, yeah. But I mean, there's something about that kind of the bravado of youth as well that sort of propels you forward, I think, as well, that changes now when you're kind of like you're just not as angry. Maybe it could just be that simple, you know, as you're older, you're kind of like, well, I'm fairly content with things. I don't really feel the need to kind of get out and, you know, prove things every day and smack you in the face with, you know, with this song, you know. And maybe that's why bands get less heavy as they progress.
I was going to say, yeah, we all mellow out, don't we, in our old age?
Yeah, totally. And I guess anything that stands out during the recording process of the EP, or anything sort of getting naked on Dave's back deck, I guess.
Yeah, well, there's a fair bit of that going on at the time, and oh god, yeah, it was quite a strange time when you sort of think back on it now. There was a lot of that going on, actually. Yeah, look, to be honest with you, I can't really. I know it sounds terrible, but I can't quite recall much of the recording process, because it's literally 20 years ago this year, which is mental. But anyway,
yeah, and I feel the same thing when I know that we recorded the bass stuff for Begins Here in 3 different sessions, but I couldn't tell you what was on each session. And I know what bass I used, simply for the fact that I still have that bass, but I wouldn't really recall anything to do with the signal chain or, you know, the writing process or any of that sort of stuff. And that's subsequent. That's another 3 or 4 years more recently than what you were doing it. And, you know, so it's if I can't remember 2002 or 3, I'm sure it's difficult to remember 2000. You know, 2001.
Yeah, I mean, I wish I had some great stories to tell, but all I remember was obviously we were at Dave's place downstairs and at the Gabba there. And
was it a fairly easy process for you?
I loved it. Yeah, it was super easy for me. I mean, playing bass, I think we've got the easy job.
Shh, don't tell them.
You know, because I remember we'd spend a day or two on drums, and then Kurt would usually then come in and do a guide track over the top. I don't know if that was actually recorded, but it might have just been a track so that I could play the bass along to it. And I'd come in, I'd pretty much do mine straight off the bat and just smash them out, done. And then you layer the guitars over the top, and then you do the vocals at the end. And so my part really in the whole thing was pretty short, maybe half a day, if that.
Oh, you just did them all at once?
I think so, yeah.
Yeah,
I mean,
wow.
I could be wrong, but I think we just sort of, yeah, is that good enough? Yep, that's fine, great. Next song.
Did you find the early touring stuff to be fairly stressful?
Very much so.
It was pretty intense.
It was intense. And that was, of course, you know, the era before the internet, really, when you think about it. So all of the stuff that we did was old school. Like I remember, you know, we'd go to festivals because I used to work back then before I became a lawyer. You know, I was working as an apprentice printer in this printing business. You know, and you know, in those days, you know, I was doing like 12-hour days, getting up at 3:30 in the morning to start at 4, and you know, play gigs at night, and it was just mental. I literally, I don't think I slept for months. You know, I get 2 or 3 hours sleep at night and get up the next day and do it all again the next day. But the point I'm sort of trying to make here is that, you know, we, you know, I working at the print shop was great in the early days because I was able to print off all of our posters, flyers, a lot of that stuff. And we would just go to gigs and just plaster them everywhere, butterfly effect stuff. Remember we went to a big day, it might have been a big day out or a Livid or some festival in Brizzy. Well, obviously it wouldn't have been big day out because it was Gold Coast, but must have been Livid or something. And we just went in there and literally plastered a joint with BE stickers and flyers and all sorts of stuff. And that's how you had to get your name out there back then. It wasn't, you know, you couldn't just upload something to YouTube and that's it. There's no Spotify back then, you know. So look, I think in terms of the early days of touring, it was stressful because it was full on. Like it was 24/7, around the clock, and we toured hard. I remember one tour we and because in those days couldn't afford to fly either, so we had to drive everywhere. And I remember we finished a gig in Melbourne, and we literally drove 24 hours back to Brisbane, slept the night in Brizzy, then got back in the van and drove straight to Cairns the next day. And it was just, oh man. Yeah, and look, I think being young guys that we were, tempers flared from time to time, being in close proximity with each other and all of that stuff.
There's always those classic stories that Dave wouldn't even let you stop for a piss. It'd be like, you have to piss in a bottle and that sort of stuff. And he'd be like, nah, got to go. We'll get there. And, you know, we might not make time. And you'd like pouring out of the, you know, you played Adelaide Unibar, I think was one of the stories. And you'd basically driven overnight from Brizzy or Sydney or somewhere and had essentially rolled up to backstage and loaded your gear out of the van onto the stage and walked straight onto the stage and played a set.
Pretty much exactly.
Being in Adelaide for like 20 minutes. You know?
Yep. That was the early days, man. It was full on. And I think, to be honest with you, that sort of led to my departure from the band, to be honest. I think that relentless schedule of, you know, I mean, it was full on. And of course, you know, we were earning bugger all back then. I remember we'd get $20 cash in hand a day or something, if that, you know, and you'd go to Coles and buy a loaf of bread and some ham or something. And that was how you survived, you know. And I just thought to myself at the time, I thought, I can't do this. This is too hard. And look, you know, I think a lot of bands in that sort of, when you're late teens, early 20s, succumb to that whole, you know, in inverted commas, the commitment factor. You know, where's your commitment? You know, are you committed or not? All that sort of stuff. And it's like, well, I am committed, but, you know, how much of my time am I expected to give up at the expense of everything else? Because I'm someone who, for me personally, I need balance in my life. And I've got other things in my life outside of music that I like to pursue. And if I don't get to do those things, I'm not in balance, if that makes sense. And so I felt at the time that my life wasn't in balance. And it was also full on. Like, we literally went from being this band that was, you know, playing at the basement in front of 50 people to suddenly we're playing at the big day out. And we all get interviewed on Triple J and, you know, touring with Grinspoon and Killing Heidi, and it happened so fast that we all kind of was just like, fuck, what's going on? And when you're at a young age like that, it's a lot to take in.
Oh, hell yeah. I mean, it was still like that for many, many years after I joined. And I mean, I was sort of lucky. I've been with my partner for a long time now, but she was we met only a couple of years after, maybe 18 months after. I actually met her on the first tour that I did with Shihad, but we didn't get together for a few months after that. But essentially, we've been together through most of that, but she was living down in Sydney and I was living in Brisbane, and so it didn't really matter. And I had nothing else in my life, and I still recall that it was super difficult. And I think I only realised the mental health effects of that sort of culture many, many years later, you know, and it led to a great deal of unhappiness. And I think that even some of the things that were not resolved or not learnt how to be done better, even from your era, were still things that remained problems. Lack of communication, or you know, where's your commitment? You know, like, or even that was still that question was like maybe even being asked of Clint when he left the band in 2012, you know, or 2011. So he's like, clearly those issues still never got resolved. And it's funny because Kurt was always super stoic, and even he sort of admitted that after the band broke up, he went through some pretty serious mental health stuff, you know. And I think that was, as you said, out of a total lack of balance. It was just pursue this goal. And it was only at the point where we started to have, where, you know, the second record, the second full length came out at number 2, woo, and then the third full length came out at number 3, and it's like, this is the first time in the band's history. And so this was 2008, you know, so something, first time in 8-10 years of a band's history that there's ever been kind of like a little dip rather. And, you know, we're still doing decent numbers at you know, at the shows on the tours in that time, but it was still like there was a crack in the armor for the first time. And I think all of those little things that were kind of had been dragged through the history of the band at that point sort of started to creep out in the cracks, you know.
Yeah, it's hard. It's like it's like any team sort of situation, you know. It's you gotta all be on the same page. You gotta have that team cohesion, and that's whether you play football or you're in a team in a business or whatever it is. It's it's all the same thing, and I think if you're not all on the same page and you're not all able to communicate, it makes it really hard. And I must admit, you know, I went through a difficult time after I left the band too, because up until that point, it was I'd poured everything into it, you know. And in fact, there was actually a really interesting documentary. I don't know if you've seen it on the ABC. It's I think it was a Four Corners one about life after sport. I can't remember what it was called, but it was fascinating because it kind of felt a little bit like how I felt after the band. They interviewed Nathan Bracken, the cricketer, and it was this fascinating story. There was a whole bunch of those Olympians and all sorts of athletes on there, and it was talking about life after sport and how. And Nathan Bracken, I think it was him. Forgive me if that's not correct to your listeners, but he was talking about, you know, this is a guy who played for Australia in the Australian cricket team, wore the baggy green, and he can't get a job. And so he's just like, you know, what do you put on your resume? Oh, I played for Australia, or I took X amount of wickets or whatever. And, you know, people are going to say, well, where's your transferable skills? I can bowl a cricket ball really well, you know. Oh, that's great. Well, can you do photocopying? You know what I mean? Like, that's how absurd it is. And these athletes can't get a job. And was talking about the mental health effects of that and a whole bunch of things. And it was really fascinating. So, you know, it's definitely worth watching. But I kind of went through something similar where you suddenly realise, shit, what am I going to do with my life? Like, that's all I was, you know, focused on. And now I'm in this position where it's not there anymore.
But I always would have thought as well that, you know, these songs were your babies as well. You know, you'd lived with them and experienced them and gone through these moments like with The Cell and had sort of like, you were a band of brothers and you're experiencing these things, and there's kind of got to be that mourning that goes on to sort of not be a part of that process anymore either. Because, you know, it's like, well, I worked really hard. I put a lot of time and energy into these songs, and I love this music, and this is my music too, you know, and then have to walk away from that part of it, you know.
Yeah, it was hard, man. But, you know, look, you know, life goes on, and I think, you know, one of the great things about it's a good chance for self-reflection, and it makes you think about what's important, and it makes you plan ahead. And, you know, as I said, I went back to uni, I did all that stuff, and I got another career up my belt, and at the same time, you know, managed to play in other bands. I mean, I played in Busby Marou, for example. For those of you your listeners who may not be familiar with them, they're a band out of Rockhampton originally. I don't know how you'd sort of describe their style, sort of folk, pop, country kind of style. Bit different to the old alternative rock scene, but great bunch of guys, awesome music. And what I loved about playing with them was, you know, everyone was chilled and everyone was on the same page. You turn up to the rehearsal room in your pluggers, and, you know, it was efficient. You'd sort of get in there, you'd smash it out, jam session over. We never forced anything. It's just a good vibe. And I mean, you know, that band, I went on, played a blues fest, Byron Bay Blues Fest, you know, Tamworth. In fact, when we did Tamworth, we had Casey Chambers come up and play with us on, we did a cover of Better Be Home Soon, which is on the He Will Have His Way album. So that was really cool, getting Casey up there playing with us. And we did the Pete Murray National Tour, did a whole bunch of TV gigs like Sunrise and all of that stuff. You know, so I was able to fit that in around my other stuff. So you're still getting the buzz, you're still getting the vibe, you're still playing these great gigs, albeit a different genre than the rock stuff. But, you know, you're still having all those same experiences, but you're able to, you got balance. You're able to fit it in around other stuff. And for me, that ticked all the boxes.
And you're probably sitting there just going, why couldn't this other thing been like this? Why did it have to be so hard? This is working just fine, and it doesn't have any of the other extra stuff going on.
Oh, look, I think, yeah, it's youth, I think. You know, I don't want to say anything bad about any of the guys, you know. I mean, we were, you know, I think we were all very young, and, you know, it is what it is. And, you know, I've always had a lot of time for the guys. I just think we were all in different places, I think, at that time. And I never, it's a shame I lost touch with them over the years, to be honest. You know, particularly Clint too, because, you know, Clint was a great guy. And, you know, like I said, one of the best vocalists I've had an opportunity to work with. I always had a lot of time for Clint. He's a really nice guy. And, you know, I'd known Ben and Kurt for years. And it's just a shame. And you see this with a lot of bands. You know, you go through that creative process, you know, that sort of irreconcilable differences, and everyone goes their separate ways, you know. It's just, unfortunately, again, part of the creative process, I think.
Oh, you know, I think we've discovered through this chat that, I mean, there's certainly swings and roundabouts with everything, you know, and there's been certainly some enjoyable moments on the road, but there's also been some really stressful moments and dark times as well. And there's something to be said for you being in a position where you kind of are now, and that has sort of worked out well as well, you know. So it's kind of, you know, neither situation really has in the end shown itself to be better or worse. They've just been different, you know. Yeah, exactly. That's cool. No, I mean, cool. Well, thanks. It's been really enlightening. Like I said, I've really missed your perspective through all that period of time, and I'm sorry it's taken me so long to reach out and have a chat.
No, look, I appreciate it, and I appreciate as well that it might have been somewhat awkward for you to probably reach out and.
No, not really. I mean, there's one good revelation from having this chat with you was I realised that it was kind of not really the decision for me to be in the band was not really something that was in my power at all. You know, it sort of happened, and you know, whatever had happened with you guys, it happened prior to me being involved. So there was no need for any sort of summary weirdness from between us two. I mean, I always like the nostalgic in me really hopes that if we ever, we're going to come to a time, I think, in the next couple of years where the EP is 21, or maybe Begins Here will be 21, and Imago will be 18, and the Final Conversation of Kings will be 16, and it's going to be like all the big birthdays. And I want to sort of come back and I would like to do one of those, you know, one album per night sort of things around the country. And I was like, do the encore and stuff, and see if you could remember how some of those bass lines go, and get up and do some of the EP songs with the band.
I'd love to, be happy to, mate. Yeah. Well, you know, to dust the cobwebs off, but yeah, mate, it'd be awesome. I'd love to do that. And I must admit, I think of all the songs on the EP, I think Pure was probably my favourite one. Probably from the bass perspective too, because it was the one song I think I did a bit of a bass run.
Yeah, you got that little bendy thing.
Little bendy bit. Yeah, I don't know about the bendy bit. That was probably a little bit. Yeah, it was probably not the best, but I did a little bit of a bass run in the verse, and I kind of like that. And
I hope that I don't know whether you ever heard many of my performances on any of the tracks, but I hope that if you ever did, that you didn't go.
No, I did listen to I can't remember which album it was, but I think Final Conversation, and mate, I think your bass playing was very good and very complimentary for the style. I think you did a great job. Yeah, really. Yeah, I think you're a good fit.
Yeah, well, again, it worked out to be what it did. You know, it was a good. I felt like the kind of creative relationship between me and Kurt was pretty good, because he was always doing these odd little like atonal sort of riffs, and I was always trying to push it into like big, like a Weezer song where I wanted to have like a big 1-4-5 pop chorus, and he was like, that shit sucks, and I'm like, oh, all right, cool. But we kind of pushed backwards and forwards, and I do think that part of the reason why the band wasn't so heavy towards the end was because I was like, we need more pop choruses. No, like, and I just got better at finding ways to sneak them under the radar, I think. Cool. Awesome, man. Well, I'll let you go. It's been almost an hour. Thank you so much for having a chat. Oh, almost forgot. The name of the podcast is Riffing, and so I'd like to know what your favourite riff of all time, or something, you know, it doesn't have to be of all time, but maybe something that, you know, you're into at the moment, or something that comes to mind.
Yeah, look, it's hard, that one, because there's so many good riffs out there. I don't know if I can tell you one that's a favourite. Look, I'd have to say my two favourite guitarists of all time would have to be Tom Morello and Jimmy Page. You know, I mean, you think about Rage Against the Machine, you think about Audio Slave, you think about, you know, Cochise, you think about Prophets of Rage. I don't know if you've heard any of that stuff. Yeah, but Tom Morello's guitar playing, mate, like, just, yeah, like, how good is this guy? Like, is there a riff this guy can't do? So, yeah, and look, in terms of Jimmy Page, obviously Immigrant Song comes to mind. You know, Led Zepp. Fantastic. And you know, riffs aside, one of the things I love about Jimmy Page is his experimentation with open tuning. You know, you think about the Rain song and think about That's the Way and the acoustic stuff, and just how amazing that was. So yeah, look, it's pretty hard to pinpoint. But look, if I was going to go old school, you know, think about around the time of the BE days and the early days. I mean, you know, one of the bands we loved back then was Silverchair, and I remember Slave. That opening riff of Slave was pretty cool. You know, I think we were listening to all sorts of stuff, Helmet, Deftones, etc. But
you know, I think that Slave riff is the one that Ben Hall mentions quite frequently.
Does he?
Yeah.
Yeah. I think that one's pretty good.
Yeah, cool.